if you'd like to be opening in your Bibles to Matthew, the 26th chapter, we're going to be looking at a section of Scripture that is very common to most, if not everyone in our audience. We're going to be looking at a most difficult prayer. And what I want us to do is kind of consider it just a little bit different than we normally would when we look through this particular set of passages. And I want us to kind of consider how this particular prayer, since Jesus is our example, how we are able to pray this type of prayer. How we can have the ability, or what do we need to do to say a most difficult prayer. And so as we get started, if you'll turn in your Bibles to the 26th chapter of the book of Matthew, we're going to start in verse 36, and we're going to read our text as we open the lesson. Beginning at verse 36, it says, "Then Jesus came with them to a place called Gethsemane, and said to the disciples, 'Sit here while I go and pray over there.' And he took with him Peter and the two sons of Zebedee, and he began to be sorrowful and deeply distressed. Then he said to them, 'My soul is exceedingly sorrowful, even to death. Stay here and watch with me.' Verse 39, he went a little further and fell on his face and prayed, saying, 'O my Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not as I will, but as you will.' Then he came to the disciples and found them asleep, and said to Peter, 'What, could you not watch with me 1 hour? Watch and pray, lest you enter into temptation. The spirit is indeed willing, but the flesh is weak.' Verse 42, he went away a second time and prayed, saying, 'O my Father, if this cup cannot pass away from me unless I drink it, your will be done.' And he came and found them asleep again, for their eyes were heavy. So he left them, went away again, and prayed a third time, saying the same words. Then he came to his disciples and said to them, 'Are you still sleeping and resting? Behold, the hour is at hand, and the Son of Man is being betrayed into the hands of sinners. Rise, let us be going. See, he who betrays me is at hand.'" And so we understand from our studies, when he makes the statement, "My betrayer is at hand," what he is initially telling them is the beginning of my crucifixion is about to happen. My death is now imminent. The time for my capture is at hand. And so what's taking place is exactly prior to, or immediately prior to, his capture or his being taken. And so I want to focus on what he's done as he sits and as he prays at this time. And the first thing that we find is that his prayer is, "Not as I will, but you will." And C.S. Lewis, who is a famous writer, and albeit a secular individual, he has written some very good information. C.S. Lewis makes the statement, there are two kinds of people. Those who say to God, "Thy will be done," as we just saw Jesus give the example, and those to whom God says, "All right then, have it your way." In other words, those who have refused to listen to what God has to say, and God allows them. God allows for man to choose to be disobedient. So there are two types of people that we can be. And if Jesus Christ is to be our supreme example and our perfect example, and his example in prayer is the one that says, "Your will be done," then that's the way that we need to pray. When we go to God in prayer, much as Jesus did, or exactly as Jesus did, our thought process should be, "Not my will, but thine be done." And it's real easy. In the world today, people think that going to God in prayer means giving me or asking for my will. It means give me what I want. And if they don't receive what they want, then they turn their backs on God. Because they're not asking for his will to be done. They are simply seeking out their own will. So we must be careful when we go to God in prayer, in supplication, and making a request. There's nothing wrong with making the request, as long as it's understood that it's only if this is your will. If it's not your will, then I have to be okay with that. And whatever it is that your will is, be done. This prayer involves the surrender of the soul. Verse 38, my soul is exceedingly sorrowful, even to death. And I want you to look at the words above that in verse 27, where he says, he began to be sorrowful and deeply distressed. And he expresses this when he says, my soul is exceedingly sorrowful, even unto death. And so this idea of exceedingly sorrowful, one writer, Poole, said, the words in the Greek are expressive of the greatest sorrow imaginable. Sit back in your mind and think about what is the worst possible case that can happen. Think about what would make you the most sorrowful. What would make you the saddest in the world? And then imagine saying, please let me avoid this, but if it's to come, let it come. See, words really can't put into, or we can't really put into words the sorrow that he feels. Barnes said, the sufferings of death are the greatest of which we have any knowledge. They are the most feared and dreaded by man, and those sufferings are therefore put for extreme, indescribable anguish. The meaning may be thus expressed. My sorrows are so great that under the burdens that I am ready to die, such is the anxiety of mind that I seem to bear the pains of death. In other words, I'm so sorrowful, I'm willing to die. Let this grief end. This idea of surrender to God is to agree to stop fighting, hiding, or resisting him because you know you can't win or succeed on your own without God's help. Surrender means a couple of things. It means stop hiding and resisting, but it also means recognize that without God, you can't win. So you need to decide whether or not you truly want to succeed in your spiritual life or whether or not you want to hide from God. It is the idea to give the control of something, i.e., give control of your life, over to God, and to allow God to influence your every action. And when you think about that, when you think about this idea of to give control over of something, that's something that's very difficult for man to want to do. Man likes to be in control. You ever met people who are at work and they don't want to assign jobs to other people because it becomes out of their control, and they feel like, okay, well, now I don't have my hands on this. I don't have the deciding factor. There are people in the church who are afraid to accept the idea of having elders because they understand that they are giving up control to the elders, that the elders will be the ones that will be making the spiritual decisions. The reason that others are willing to do that is because they recognize that those elders are going to do what's best for them spiritually. Giving your life over to God, giving God full control, full surrender in everything, is a recognition that while I may not be able to set into motion the things that I want in motion, it's all within your power. I know and can be confident that it's your will for my good, ultimately and spiritually. It's the idea of saying, I surrender, right? We know what surrender means. We know what the white flag means in battle, right? I surrender means I give up. I give up. You now have complete control. Surrender in battle is not necessarily a good thing, but surrender to God is for our benefits. And we need to recognize that Jesus has called his disciples to surrender. And we would fall into that category of being one of his disciples. In Matthew, the 16th chapter, verses 24 and 25, Jesus said to his disciples, "If anyone desires to come after me, let him deny himself and take up the cross and follow me. For whoever desires to save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake will find it." Let him deny himself, give up himself, and be willing to give up oneself even to the point of death. If that's what it is that God has for me, if that's what God's plan for me is, then I need to be willing to allow him to take my life without resistance. I need to be willing to give myself up, even to the point of death. And if I do so, when he says, whoever do so finds his life, means he finds his spiritual life, the one who finds an eternal life in a home with God. So Jesus expected it of the disciples then. He expects it of you and me today. And again, if we are to be able to pray this most difficult prayer, we need to be able to pray to God, I'm willing to surrender, right? I'm willing to completely surrender to whatever it is your decision is. Paul said to the Galatians, "I have been crucified with Christ. It is no longer I who live, but Christ lives in me. And the life which I now live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God, who loved and gave himself for me." It says, "I have been crucified with Christ, and it is no longer I who live, but Christ lives in me. And the life which I do live, in the flesh, I now live by faith in the Son of God." And living by faith in the Son of God and living by faith in God is to say, I surrender to your will. I will do what it is that you have for me to do. Not only does it deal with the idea of surrender of the soul, but in verse 39, and we touched on this at the beginning, it deals with the idea of surrender of one's will. And some of us can be pretty hard-headed. I don't know how else to put it. Some of us can be very hard-headed. We are not willing to change our way of thinking. This is what I want, when I want, how I want. And we're not willing to surrender to that. You know, we understand, actually the world understands, that that's just a true statement. That man is that way. There was a whole campaign slogan by Burger King based on that, wasn't it? Have it your way. It's all however you want it to be. If you don't want this or you don't want this, then you don't have to have it. You can have it exactly your way. God says, have it my way. And if you don't want this and you don't want this, you still must have it, or you can choose to suffer the consequences. But there is this idea. Part of that's involved in the idea, just as a sub-point, and I mentioned the idea of in dealing with surrendering your will to others, and maybe that involves to an eldership. And I want you to kind of look at just two examples of individuals who were willing to surrender their will. But notice as we read through these scriptures what their desire is at the beginning. Notice what their will is. Notice what God's answer is, and then notice how they respond, because that's the example for us. So again, ask yourself, what's the will of the individual? What's the answer God gives them? And how do they respond? We're going to start in 2 Samuel. We're going to start at 2 Samuel chapter 12, and we're going to look at verses 13 through 24. 2 Samuel chapter 12. Verses 13 through 24. We understand that this is following the sin of David and his actions. And he admits in verse 13, David said to Nathan, "I have sinned against the Lord." And Nathan said to David, "The Lord also has put away your sin. You shall not die." So he has said, you will not die for this sin. That sounds good, right? He's got to be grateful. The Lord has said, you shall not die for this act. But look at the next word. However, Okay. We would say sometimes, but. So you will not die. However, because by this deed you have given great occasion to the enemies of the Lord to blaspheme, the child also who is born to you shall surely die. Can you imagine being told that as a future parent? You have a child on the way and you're told, guess what, Dad? You're not going to die. But that child that you're waiting for, he is. Wow. All of a sudden, that hits hard, doesn't it? That hurts. How many of us would say I would give up my life for my child? He says just the opposite. Your child has to give up his life for you. It's pretty serious when we get into God and his punishments. Picking up at verse 15. Then Nathan departed to his house, and the Lord struck the child that Uriah's wife bore to David, and it became very ill. David therefore pleaded with God for the child, and David fasted and went in and lay all night on the ground. So we're looking at David here and what he's doing. And David therefore pleaded with God for the child, and David fasted and went in and lay all night on the ground. So he is pleading for the child to be born, right? He's going to God with, this is what I desire, right? This is my will. So the elders of the house arose and went to him to raise him up for the ground, but he would not, nor did he eat food with them. Verse 18. Then on the seventh day it came to pass that the child died. So initially it was struck ill, right? Child was struck ill. David begins to plead with God for the child. 7 days later, the child dies. And the servants of David were afraid to tell him that the child was dead, for they said, indeed, while the child was still alive, we spoke to him, and he would not heed our voice. How can we tell him that the child is dead? He may do some harm. How can we go now and tell him? We've seen exactly how he's reacted to just the sickness of his child. How can we go and tell him his child is now dead? Verse 19. When David saw that his servants were whispering, David perceived that the child was dead. Therefore David said to his servants, is the child dead? Right? He could see by their actions that they had something they didn't want to tell him, but something that needed to be said. And so they said, yes, he is dead. So David arose from the ground, washed and anointed himself, and changed his clothes. Again, this is 7 days later, after being in the same clothes and being on the ground, and changed his clothes, and he went into the house of the Lord, and he worshiped. He's told God his desire. He's held to it. He's done these things for 7 days. God still takes his child. God says, no, my will is that your child is to die. And his response is to go into the temple and worship. Okay? That's quite a response to what his desire was. Then he went to his own house, and when he requested, they set food before him, and he ate. So now he's eating again. Look at the response of the servants. Verse 21, then his servants said to him, what is this that you have done? You fasted and wept for the child while he was alive, but when the child died, you arose and ate food? So he said, verse 22, while the child was still alive, I fasted and wept, for I said, who can tell whether the Lord will be gracious to me that this child may live? So while he's still alive, there's still hope in David's mind, right? There's still time for me to request of God that he change his mind. Right? That's David's desire. Change your mind. I don't want to lose this child. Verse 23, but now he is dead. Why should I fast? Doesn't do any good now to request of God that the child live, because he's now gone. The decision's been made. Can I bring him back again? I shall go to him, but he shall not return to me. David had a desire. David's will was that the child be spared. David did everything in his power to achieve his will, including fasting and prayer and keeping his head to the ground for 7 days. But God said no. God said no. Didn't have to say it in words. He said it in action. The child died. Most of us think, well, boy, people of the world today, their instinct and their reaction would be to be mad at God. God, for the last 7 days, you've allowed him to live, and I've done everything that I can, and I've prayed, and I've prayed, and I've prayed, and certainly you don't want to take, God, you're too good a God to take a child from someone. That child's innocent. That child didn't do anything. And you know what? That child is innocent. And that child didn't do anything. That child is waiting in heaven, I believe. And you can talk to me about that later, but that child had a sinless life, had 7 days. That child was innocent, and God protects the innocent. I believe that. I believe God protects the innocent. But the child is taken, and his response is now to go worship God. I'm going to go into the temple, I'm going to worship God, then I'm going to clean myself up, and I'll go ahead and eat. Isn't that interesting? The other thing most of us might do is after 7 days, after it's all over, we might as well go get ourselves cleaned up and get some food. It's been 7 days without food. He goes and worships first. His first thought is, praise God. His second thought is, then take care of myself. Right? That is surrender of the will. That is allowing for God's will to be done despite your desire. Our second example is going to come from 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verses 1 through 10. Another very familiar passage. I'm going to pick up at verse 7 for time's sake. But he is talking about this idea of it is not profitable for, Paul saying it is not profitable for me to boast. You know? And when you teach and when people follow after you and when people are saying what a great speaker and teacher you are, man can develop what we'll call big head. Man can start feeling pretty full of himself. Just listen to the way people talk about Lenny Chapman when he used to preach, because I'm not using me. Listen to people used to listen to Lenny. That guy was a great preacher. Man, he was on it. He knew what he was talking about, and he shared the word, and he was a great encouragement. And Lenny could get a big head if he wanted to. Be real easy for him. Yeah, I'm good. Every lesson that I deliver is great. Everything that I say is great, and all of a sudden it's all about Lenny and not about God. And so Paul is saying, I don't want to boast. It would not be profitable for me to boast. So we're going to pick up at verse 7. He says, unless I should be exalted above measure by the abundance of the revelations, a thorn in the flesh was given to me, a messenger of Satan to buffet me, lest I be exalted above measure. So I've been given this thorn in the flesh, and we don't know what it is, but we know where it came from. He was given a thorn in the flesh, and so he won't be exalted. And he says, concerning this thing, this thorn in the flesh, I pleaded with the Lord 3 times that it might depart from me. My will was, get rid of this, Lord. Remove whatever this thing is that's a hindrance to me. And I didn't ask once, and I didn't ask twice. I asked 3 times because my will was, this is what I want. You notice what's interesting about that? Jesus didn't pray once. Jesus didn't pray twice. Jesus prayed 3 times. And then recognized the will be done. Continuing on, verse 9, he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my strength is made perfect in weakness. That sounds good, right? What David heard at the beginning sounded good, so that sounds good. He says, though, at this point, he says, therefore, now for him, therefore, most gladly, I would rather boast in my infirmities, that the power of Christ may rest upon me. Therefore, I take pleasure in infirmities, in reproaches, in needs and persecutions, in distresses, for Christ's strength. For when I am weak, then I am strong. Jesus says, my will for you is to have this thorn in the flesh. Paul says, okay, I've told you what my will is 3 times, but I now realize it's not your will, so I'm going to be content with, and I'm going to surrender my will to yours. And I'm going to allow for control. And full surrender means Paul's not going to complain about the thorn in the flesh anymore, right? Does it say that it went away? Never tells us that he had it, but he never complains about it. We never hear him complain, right? Sometimes accepting situations means they stay the way they are. Sometimes it means I want something else to happen, but I'm willing to accept your will. And you think, no, well, and the problem or the thing that bothers you stays with you. The difficulty stays with you. And so we must recognize that that can happen. Continuing on, think about the idea of, this is a great illustration. Imagine trying to take a dog somewhere that they don't want to go. You've got a dog on a leash, and you're walking the dog, and your will is to take the dog over there, and the dog's will is, I'm staying right here. For a while, who wins? For a while, the dog wins. For a while, the dog wins. He fights and fights and fights to stay on his own and not be dragged into. That's a great analogy for man, too. Some men will fight and fight and fight, but ultimately, God's will can win out, just like man's will overcome the dog. But some will just say, okay, some will just decide, you know what? If that's the way you're going to be, dog, then that's your decision, right? They give up. They've tried and tried and tried. God says, at some point, God says that if you don't want to follow my will, that's your decision. There may be consequences. That dog may suffer consequences for not obeying its master. And man may suffer consequences for not obeying his master. Or what's the whole idea behind the bridle and the bit in a horse's mouth, right? They're put there so that the horse won't go where it wills to go, but will go where you desire it to go, right? That's the whole point behind it. Why did they put it in there? Because without it, horses are strong-willed. And they're going to turn and they're going to go the way they want to go unless something causes them or forces them, in the case of that, to yield their will, right? To do what the master or what the writer desires them to do. We should ask ourselves, are we refusing to come to Christ because of our stubborn will? Talk about stubborn will. Have we just flat said, I just don't want to? I'm not going to. You ever seen people that get to a point where they start out using or trying to use logic when they're in a discussion or an argument, and pretty soon all that goes out the door, and they're just going to say no to say no, even though they get to a point where they realize it makes absolutely no common sense, right? Makes no common sense whatsoever. I understand what you're saying, but the answer is still no. Okay, you've proven to me that Jesus Christ is the Son of God and that he said I should be baptized, but my answer is no. I'm just not going to do it because it's not what I want to do. Right? You see that idea? We need to ask ourselves, are we in that position? Are we refusing to forgive because of a stubborn will? Have we gotten so upset with someone that we're not willing to forgive? You know what? What if Christ got upset with something, what if Christ decided to be upset about something you or I did and decided that he wasn't going to forgive, right? And we're taught we're to forgive others as Christ has forgiven us, right? Surrender to God and make his will your own. The only way that you can live life according to your will and arrive in heaven is simply to make your will God's will. If you want it to be your will that gets you where you, then you've got to match it up with the will of God. Because in the end, his will be done. There will be consequences for all actions. Very quickly, verses 40 through 46. The prayer requires dedication when others have failed. Verse 40, then he came to the disciples and found them sleeping. Here he is. He asked them to watch and pray, right? He asked them to wait for me, right? They didn't do it. And he came and found them asleep again, so a second time. Verse 43. Then he came to his disciples and said to them, are you still sleeping? Verse 45. Failure, 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 right? They're not doing what they're supposed to be doing. In order for God's will to exist, then regardless of what others are doing, we must still do our part, right? It doesn't matter that others have failed. How easy it must have been for the disciples to give in to their desire for sleep. They were tired, right? You've been tired, right? So tired that you want to go. That's an easy thing to do. It's easy to just take a rest and fall to sleep. Today, people are likely to give in to their fleshly desires. And then what will we do? Others around us have failed. Others around us have given in. Well, this prayer requires dedication if we mean it. What will we do? Well, in order to answer that question, we need to ask, what did Jesus do? We don't have to say, what would Jesus do, like so many people remember from their phrases in the Old. But just ask, what did Jesus do? Well, we have the answer. Again, a second time, he went away and prayed. So he finds them fail, and he goes and prays again. Right? They failed, he goes on. And then, verse 44. So he left them, went away again, and prayed a third time. So he comes back a second time. He sees failure a second time upon his request. And he still goes and does what he's supposed to do, regardless of the actions of others. And so we are coming to the conclusion of our lesson this morning. And we're again asking ourselves, have I been too stubborn and unwilling to surrender my soul and will unto God? And who can answer that question for you? Who can answer that question? Can you come to me and ask me? Can Doug walk up to me and say, hey, Rob, have I been too stubborn to surrender my will to God? Well, gee, Doug, I don't know. I don't know. Only you can answer that question. I can ask you what you've done, right? Doug, I could say, well, have you done these things? But who really can answer the question truthfully? Are you willing to make a change? Are you willing to make a change like our examples did? David, who's called a man after God's own heart, once he realized that his will wasn't God's will, he accepted it and he changed and he moved on, right? Once Paul realized that his will and God's will were not the same, he accepted it and he went forward. They didn't say, oh, well, because I don't get what I want, I don't have to continue to do what I'm required to do. They said, I accept it and I move on. The question is, if you're in a situation where you've been too stubborn, either to first be buried in the waters of baptism and rise anew and live a Christian walk, or if you've committed sin and you know that you need to make it right and you're just too stubborn, you say, well, I just don't want to. No. Well, the opportunity for you exists to do that. Whatever you need to do to make your life right with God, whatever you need to do to make God's will your will, we would like to help you do while we stand and while we sing.